monastery have known that his palace, his world, his friends, and even his country would be washed over like the sands of the mandala, causing great loss and sorrow for his people. In 1950, just 3 months after the communist takeover of China, Chairman Mao Zedong announced his plans to send in Red Army troops to liberate Tibet from elitist Dalai Lama rule. In October 1950, Chinese troops overran Tibetan resistance in outlying areas and headed for the capital at Lhasa. The Dalai Lama was 15 years old and had little or no political experience. Nevertheless, he had to put his boyhood behind him and immediately prepare to lead his country. The Dalai Lama may have seen China as a solution to many problems facing his country. He was respectful of Mao and socialism and knew Tibet needed to be brought into the modern world. His wish was to negotiate with the Chinese with truth and dignity face to face. But by 1951, the Chinese had forced a delegation to sign a 17-point agreement giving Tibet to China, and Chinese troops were marching into the heart of Lhasa. At first, the Chinese troops were respectful, but their presence in Lhasa put a tremendous burden on the Tibetan economy. Thousands of troops needed to be fed. The tiny Tibetan army was disarmed, and dissidents were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. Knowing the Dalai Lama's fascination with modernization and mechanization, Mao invited him to Peking in 1953. Mao used the media coverage of the event to convince his people that Tibet had joined the Chinese state. However, the Dalai Lama used the opportunity to explain the uniqueness of Tibet to Mao personally. He believed that Mao was a good and reasonable man, and after they met, the Dalai Lama was almost convinced that China's objective was to leave Tibet's culture alone and only improve its infrastructure. But in his last meeting with Mao, the communist ruler leaned over to him and told him that religion was poison. It undermines and retards the progress of any country, he said. Suddenly, the Dalai Lama realized that Mao was an enemy of Buddhism and that deeper trouble for Tibet was on the way. He returned to Lhasa after a year away, a troubled man. Knowing that the USA was supposedly a great defender of freedom and liberty, the Dalai Lama called on the Americans to help defend himself from Chinese occupation. He got no response from America, whose Christian communities saw little value in the preservation of Tibet's arcane and unknowable religion, and whose business and political leaders saw little economic value in Tibet's protection. Next, the Dalai Lama appealed to his neighbor to the south, India, the birthplace of Buddhism. His speeches were written for him by the Chinese, but after crossing the border, he threw them away and spoke from the heart. His nation needed help. Everywhere he went, the young Dalai Lama made films, like a boy enthusiastically discovering the world around him. But that world was about to crumble. Back in Lhasa, reports of Chinese atrocities abounded. On March 10th, after being invited to a suspicious dance performance alone by the Chinese army, 30,000 Tibetans massed around their god king to protect him. In response, the Chinese began an attack on the Dalai Lama's palaces and on the crowds themselves. Inside the palace, confusion broke out. That night, disguised as a lowly soldier with a rifle on his side, the Dalai Lama slipped past his own people and the Chinese army, and with his family and trusted friends by his side, raced for the Indian border. After a long and difficult journey through mud and blizzards, and suffering from dysentery and fever, the Dalai Lama renounced all agreements with the Chinese and announced the formation of the Tibetan government in exile. In the days that followed, the Chinese shelled and destroyed the summer palace and machine-gunned the crowds outside. In the ensuing weeks and months of chaos, 87,000 people were massacred.
In 1949 Chinese Mao is violent occupation Tibet, and they kill my people. 1,200,000 killed, 6,000 Buddhist monasteries destroyed. They need my land. They don't need my people.
As the Cultural Revolution rolled forward, the Chinese systematically destroyed all art, books, everything ancient, everything with religious significance. Upon arriving in northern India, the Dalai Lama felt an enormous sense of relief. In India's democratic climate, he could speak his mind freely. Soon, over 100,000 refugees would follow him over the hills, escaping Chinese persecution. Later, the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan community were offered asylum in a small town at the base of the Himalayas known as Dharamsala. Little did he know, he would be establishing a capital in exile there, which has lasted for more than 40 years. It was here that I planned to meet His Holiness and interview him.